Heaven has a favorite name for Jesus, and it isn't Jesus. In the last book of the Bible, by most counts, he's called by his own name around 14 times. He's called the Lamb 28. Heaven looks at the risen, glorified, ruling Christ and keeps calling him an animal that gets killed. That's not a poetic habit. It's the closing of a file that was opened 2,000 years earlier, on a mountainside, by a boy carrying firewood who turned to his father and asked one question: "Where is the lamb?" And here's the part I'd never noticed, the part most of us were never shown. In that chapter, the question is never actually answered. The Bible leaves the file open, on purpose, and it doesn't close it until almost the very last page. Stay with me, because this isn't a sermon, it's a paper trail. Genesis, chapter 22. An old man named Abraham climbs a mountain in the land of Moriah with his son Isaac. He has been told to do the unthinkable, to offer the boy himself. Isaac doesn't know that. What Isaac knows is the checklist of a sacrifice, because he's seen this done his whole life. Fire, wood, knife, animal, and walking up that hill, he does the math and comes up one item short. "My father, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Hold that question. It's about to become the longest-running open question in the entire Bible. Abraham answers with one of the most loaded sentences in the Old Testament. God will provide himself a lamb. Now, in the Hebrew, the natural way to read that is simply, God will provide for himself a lamb. God will supply the animal. That's the plain sense, and we should be honest about it. But generations of readers have noticed you can also hear it a second way. God will provide himself as the lamb. And the rest of this video is really the story of why that second hearing refused to die. Because here's the detail that changed how I read this whole chapter. The word Isaac uses, and the word Abraham uses back, is the Hebrew word seh, a lamb, a young one from the flock. Now watch what actually shows up on that mountain. At the last possible moment, the knife is stopped, and Abraham looks up and sees an animal caught in a thicket by its horns. And the text is precise. It is not a seh, it's an ayil, a ram, a full-grown male, a different word, a different animal. I'll be honest with you. For years, I read Genesis 22 the way I'd been taught to read it, as a neat, closed story. Question asked, ram provided, everyone goes home. Until I actually put the two Hebrew words side by side, and then it hit me. The chapter answers the emergency, but it never answers the question. Isaac asked, "Where is the lamb?" God sent a ram. The promise, God will provide himself a lamb, is still sitting there, unclaimed, open. Abraham seems to have felt that too, because of what he names the place. Not the mountain where God provided, past tense, done, closed. He names it Jehovah Jireh, and Genesis adds, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen," shall be, future tense. As if the old man walked down that hill, knowing the real answer to his son's question hadn't arrived yet. And I want to be fair here. This story, Jewish tradition calls it the Akedah, the binding, is one of the most treasured and most wrestled with texts in Judaism, with its own deep readings that don't run where we're about to run. That's worth respecting. But inside the Bible's own storyline, a question has now been asked on the record. Where is the lamb? Keep your eye on it, because about 400 years later, in Egypt, the lamb comes back, and this time, it comes with a deadline. Exodus, chapter 12. Abraham's descendants have become a nation of slaves in Egypt, and the night of their rescue is built, almost line by line, around a lamb. Every household is told to take one, and notice how strangely specific the instructions are. Take the lamb on the 10th day of the month. Keep it until the 14th. 4 days. 4 days with a lamb living in your house. Examined, watched, checked for any blemish or defect, close enough that the children start treating it like a pet. Whatever else those 4 days did, they made sure of one thing. Nobody killed a lamb that night as a stranger. Then the blood of the lamb goes onto the doorframe, the two side posts, the beam across the top, brushed on with a bundle of a spiky little plant called hyssop. Remember the hyssop. File it next to the open question, because it's going to come back at the worst possible moment in the story. And death, moving through Egypt that night, passes over every house marked by the blood of a lamb. One more instruction, and it's the strangest one. The lamb was to be eaten in haste, roasted whole, and the text adds this rule: out of nowhere, you shall not break a bone of it. Not one. Exodus 12, verse 46. Why would that matter? Why would a bone matter on a night like that? The text doesn't say. It just quietly loads the gun and sets it on the table. Hold on to that one too. And then comes my favorite detail in the whole chapter, the one that ties this night directly back to Moriah. God tells them to keep this meal every single year, forever. And he says, when your children ask you, what does this mean? You will tell them. Did you catch it? The ritual has a question built into it. Every generation, at every table, a child is scripted to look up at a parent and ask about the lamb, which means the question Isaac asked on the mountain, a boy asking his father about a lamb, got institutionalized. For roughly 15 centuries, depending on how you date the Exodus, that question echoed down family tables, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, the youngest child asking, in effect, where is the lamb and what does it mean? The Bible didn't let the question die. It made the question a holiday. And it went further. When Israel built the tabernacle and later the temple, God commanded a standing offering called the tamid, the continual. Exodus 29, 2 lambs of the first year, day by day, continually. One every morning, one every evening, every day, no holidays off. Run the numbers on that. Over 700 lambs a year after year, century after century, rivers of them, through the whole life of the temple, morning and evening, the whole nation's worship was set to the rhythm of a lamb dying. And yet, here's the thing, the repetition itself confesses. If any one of those lambs had actually been the lamb, the answer to Isaac's question, you could have stopped. You never got to stop. Tomorrow morning, another lamb. Tomorrow evening, another. The repetition was the system admitting, twice a day, that the file was still open. Then, in the darkest century of Israel's story, the temple burned, the people dragged to Babylon in chains. A prophet writes down the strangest sentence yet. He stops talking about the lamb as an it. He starts talking about the lamb as a him. Isaiah chapter 53. It's a poem about a figure the text calls the servant, someone despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, someone wounded, the prophet says, not for his own wrongs, but for everyone else's. And right in the middle of the poem, the old vocabulary surfaces, except the grammar has changed. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. For 1,000 years, the lamb had been an animal, something you take, keep, examine, kill. Now, for the first time, the lamb has a face. A person who suffers silently, who carries the weight of a whole people, whose wounds somehow heal the very people who wounded him. Read it cold, with nothing attached, and it is one of the most haunting passages in ancient literature. Now, honesty, because that's the deal on this channel. Who is the servant? That is genuinely debated, and it has been for a very long time. Much of Jewish tradition reads the servant as Israel itself, the whole suffering people, personified. And if you read the surrounding chapters, you can see exactly why. Isaiah calls Israel my servant more than once. Christian readers, from the very beginning, saw in this poem the portrait of one specific man. That's a real divide, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. But notice what both readings agree on. The prophet has taken the lamb of the altar and turned it into a someone. The category has changed. The question, where is the lamb, has quietly become, who is the lamb? And before anyone wonders whether this poem was written after the fact and slipped back in, we have the receipt. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls sits the great Isaiah scroll, a complete copy of this book, copied out at least a century before Jesus of Nazareth was born. You can look at photographs of it tonight. Chapter 53 is right there, ink on leather, waiting, written by a scribe who had no idea what the next century would do with it. Then the prophets fall silent. Centuries pass. Empires roll over the land. Persia, Greece, Rome. The lambs keep dying, morning and evening. The children keep asking at the table. And then one afternoon, out at a river crossing east of Jerusalem, a wild-looking preacher in camel hair looks up, sees a man walking toward him, and points. John chapter 1, verse 29. Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. The Greek word is amnos, the sacrificial lamb, the same word the ancient Greek translation of Isaiah used for that lamb led to the slaughter. And I need you to feel the weight of what just happened, because familiarity has sanded it smooth. For 2,000 years, from Moriah on, a question has been hanging in the air of this story. Where is the lamb? Isaac asked it. Every Passover child asked it. Twice a day, the temple asked it in blood and smoke. And now, for the first time in the entire Bible, a human being looks at another human being, points, and answers it. Not behold a teacher, not behold a king, though both were true. Behold the Lamb of God. The one God would provide, himself. Whatever John the Baptist fully understood in that moment, and the Gospels suggest even he was still working it out, the writer wants you to hear Genesis 22 land on a riverbank. 3 years later, that man is executed in Jerusalem, at Passover. Now, the Gospel writers differ slightly in how they lay out the timing of that week. John's Gospel seems to place the death right when the Passover lambs were being prepared, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke frame the Last Supper as a Passover meal, and scholars have gone back and forth on how to fit those together for a very long time. I'm not going to flatten that debate. What no one debates is the setting itself. He dies at Passover, the one festival on the calendar that exists to make people ask about a lamb. And it's here, at the cross, that two tiny details from Exodus 12 come back. The two things I told you to file away. Detail 1. The hyssop. John records that as Jesus was dying, someone soaked a sponge and lifted it to his lips on a stalk of hyssop. The same humble plant that painted lamb's blood on the doorframes in Egypt now touches the lips of the man John's Gospel introduced as the Lamb. Of all the sticks in Jerusalem, the text remembers that one. Detail 2. The bones. It was Roman practice, John tells us, to break the legs of the crucified, to speed up death. The soldiers break the legs of the two men on either side. They come to him, and he's already dead. They don't break his. And John stops the narrative, steps out from behind the camera, and tells you why he included that. That the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him shall not be broken. That's the Passover lamb rule. Exodus 12:46. The rule that made no sense the night it was given. 1,500 years early, someone wrote into the instructions for a meal that the lamb's bones must stay whole. And on a Friday afternoon, outside Jerusalem, a Roman soldier with a mallet unknowingly obeyed it. Now, a careful reader will note that line also echoes Psalm 34, and John may be hearing both at once. Fine. Either way, John is telling you plainly what he sees on that hill, the Passover, happening to a person. One more echo, and you might remember it if you watched our video on the Bible's whole story. He climbs that hill, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice on his back, the way another son once carried wood up another hill, 2,000 years before, walking beside a father, asking where the lamb was. And if the story ended there, the lamb would be exactly what lambs had always been in this story, a victim, precious, innocent, and dead. But the last book of the Bible does something with this image so strange, so deliberately upside down, that it's the reason we started this whole investigation with a number. Revelation, chapters 4 and 5. John, in exile on a prison island, is shown the throne room of heaven. In the right hand of the one on the throne is a scroll, sealed with 7 seals, the title deed, as it were, to how the whole story ends. And a mighty angel asks, "Who is worthy to open it?" And no one is found, not in heaven, not on earth. And John, the last living apostle, the man who stood at the cross, starts to weep. Then one of the elders says to him, "Stop weeping. Look, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has prevailed." A lion. Finally, after all the slaughtered innocents of this long story, a predator, a conqueror, the king of beasts. John turns to look at the lion. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne stood a lamb, as it had been slain. He hears lion. He turns, and he sees a lamb, still carrying the marks of its death, and standing. Slain, the text says, yet on its feet. Alive. That is the single greatest bait and switch in the Bible, and it is entirely on purpose. The lion conquered by being the lamb. Heaven's throne room erupts, and listen to what the new song actually says. Worthy is the lamb that was slain. Not worthy despite being slain. Worthy because. And here the language does one last curious thing. The word for lamb in Revelation is not amnos, the word from the riverbank. It's arnion, and Revelation uses it for Christ, by most counts, 28 times. Originally, arnion was a diminutive, little lamb, a lamb you could hold. Now, full honesty. By the 1st century, that little flavor had likely worn off in everyday Greek, and scholars genuinely debate whether John chose the word for contrast, the little lamb against the monstrous beast, or simply as a matter of style. We can't be certain, and I won't pretend we can. But what needs no debate is the pattern of the choice itself. 28 times, the book that unveils Christ at his most glorious reaches, past every available title, King, Lord, Lion, Word, and keeps saying Lamb. The Lamb opens the seals, the Lamb's book of life, the marriage supper of the Lamb. And at the very end, in the city where the story closes, there is no temple and no sun, because, the text says, the Lamb is the light thereof. The throne at the center of the new creation is called, in the Bible's final chapter, the throne of God and of the Lamb. So close the file with me. 2,000 years of story earlier, a boy climbing a mountain asked his father, "Where is the lamb?" And the chapter refused to answer him. Egypt answered with a night. The temple answered twice a day for centuries, and every answer expired by morning. Isaiah answered with a face. A man in a river answered with a finger pointing, and the last book of the Bible answers with a throne. Here is the Lamb. He was always the Lamb. The oldest open question in the Bible isn't answered by a lion who conquered by killing. It's answered by a lamb who conquered by dying. If somewhere in this thread that image caught on something in you, maybe the wounds he's still wearing, standing there, tell me in the comments, even in one word, what it touched. I read every single one, and honestly, those comments are half the reason I keep making these. Let me give you the whole thread in one breath. A question is asked on a mountain and left open. A nation is taught to re-ask it every year at the family table, children looking up at parents, for 1,500 years. A temple repeats it in blood every morning and every evening. A prophet in exile turns the lamb into a person. A man in a river points at the answer. On a Passover Friday, the hyssop and the unbroken bones sign the receipt. And on the last page, the answer is not lying dead on an altar. He is standing at the center of the throne, wearing his scars like credentials. And maybe that's the piece of this that follows you out of the video. Whoever you are, whether you've buried a parent or sat up all night beside a hospital bed, or you're carrying a wound this year that nobody at church can see, notice what heaven did with wounds. It didn't edit them out of the picture. The Lamb in glory is recognizable by his scars. In this story, the marks of the worst day are not what disqualify you from the throne room. They're what the singing is about. 66 books, one question, asked by a child. And an answer that took 2,000 years, arrived looking nothing like a conqueror, and now sits on the throne with the light of a whole city coming off him. Once you've seen that thread, you can't read the word lamb in this book, any page of it, the same way again. Now, this lamb thread is just one strand of something bigger. The whole Bible, all 66 books, folds together into a single story, a seed planted in a broken garden that grows through everything you just watched into a city. We trace that entire storyline, beginning to end, in one video. It's on your screen right now. And if this one changed how you read the word lamb, that one will change how you read the whole book. And if you want to keep pulling these buried threads with us, subscribe. There are a lot more files to open.